In the summer of 1862, the war was not going well for the North. In the West, the Union advance had ground to a halt. In the East, the Union Army had been driven from the gates of Richmond all the way back to Washington. Frustrated, President Abraham Lincoln reshuffled his generals. Grant was restored to command. That fall, Grant led his Army of the Tennessee into the heart of cotton country, setting in motion a revolution that would shatter the foundations of the Old South. I am extended now like a peninsula into an enemy's country, he wrote. Territory occupied by people terribly embittered and hostile to us. Confederate guerrillas destroyed his rail lines and supply depots, slowing his advance. Civilians laid mines and spied for the Confederacy. It was a desperate fight to preserve a way of life. As word of the Union advance reached plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi, thousands of slaves rushed toward Grant's lines.
The coming of the Union Army is heralded both in black folklore and in black religious expression as a moment of liberation, of a coming of redeemers to save them from bondage. But it also carries with it a recognition, too, in many parts, that this army of liberation is also comprised of soldiers, in some cases, who are very hostile to these people. Why are we freeing them? This is not a war about slavery. This is a war to preserve the Union.
At first, Grant turned the fugitive slaves away, fearing they would overwhelm his lines. I have no hobby of my own in regard to the Negro, he said to his father, either to effect his freedom or to continue his bondage.
Grant has the problem that every commander has of not knowing exactly how to deal with the slaves who are fleeing to his army. And Grant himself, as a former slaveholder, and as the husband of somebody who continued to hold slaves and who in fact had brought them into Mississippi, is not one from whom one would expect an enlightened attitude towards this tremendous influx. And yet, it comes.
I think he realized, as everybody with a brain did, that slavery was over. And you're going to have to do something with the slaves. And what are you going to do? You have to put them to work. He saw people coming into his lines. They needed to be fed. Work needed to be done. Hey, let's use them. Why not? But there were all kinds of people who would have erected barriers, who would have said, oh, they can't do it. Oh, they don't have the capacity. So Grant said, okay, put them to work. If they can't work, they can't work. We'll find out. And he was very, very frank about saying that, which was not what people did in the 19th century.
Grant set up camps where the former slaves would help provide for their own care by harvesting cotton and corn from nearby abandoned plantations under the supervision of Union authorities.
The idea in mind, as Grant explained it, is that if we can begin to show the American public that black slaves can act in a responsible fashion, can take care of themselves economically, can become self-sufficient, maybe the attitudes, the racial attitudes of Americans will change. This is important because it shows that Grant is fighting, in a sense, against slavery, not just to hurt the South. When you take slaves away from the South, you strike at the economic vitals of the South. But he also, has, I think, a sense that something has to be done for these recently freed people. They just can't be left alone.
President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863. Freed slaves began to be inducted into the Union Army. At first, Grant doubted the newly armed soldiers could be trusted in the front lines and confined them to garrison duty. But when he heard of their fierce defense of a Union camp at Milliken's Bend in Louisiana, the general slowly began to change his mind. By arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally, Grant wrote Lincoln. They will make good soldiers, and taking them from the enemy weakens him in the same proportion they strengthen us.
It seemed to him that it was an important part of Union strategy to use the slaves against their former masters. And he very much agreed with Lincoln on that. And in the process of forming black regiments and watching them in action, he came to respect the right of black people to demand political equality.